Muammar Gaddafi did not fear anyone, not the United States, not Europe, and not even NATO. That's because he trusted his people and African presidents who were in power because of him. However, he did not know that all of them would betray them. You see, we often speak of NATO bombs, UN resolutions, and Western hypocrisy when recalling the brutal fall of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. We point to France, the United States, and Britain, and we ask, how could they so brazenly destroy a sovereign African nation? But what if the real betrayal didn't come from across the ocean, but from within Africa itself? What if the man who once welcomed Gaddafi into his country, dined with him, called him brother, and received his financial and military support, turned out to be the very man who opened the back door for Gaddafi's enemies? Muammar Gaddafi was not just a Libyan leader. He was Africa's architect-in-chief, the one who helped end civil wars, built palaces, supported liberation movements, and backed presidents when even their own armies wouldn't. Yet when he needed allies most, they disappeared. Or worse, they helped in his downfall. So, who betrayed Gaddafi? In this video, let's find out. Before Gaddafi was demonized by the West, before NATO's bombs shattered his dream of a unified Africa, he was a kingmaker on the continent. And few relationships capture this more deeply than his decades-long connection with Uganda. Gaddafi's ties to Uganda did not begin with Museveni. They began in the chaotic 1970s, under the brutal reign of Idi Amin, when the Libyan leader took it upon himself to act as Uganda's defender and sponsor. While Western nations distanced themselves from Amin's regime, Gaddafi stood firm. He sent arms, aircraft, and even Libyan soldiers to defend Amin's sovereignty, not because he supported dictatorship, but because he believed no African nation should fall without the backing of its brothers. When Amin was overthrown in 1979 and fled into exile, Gaddafi did not cut ties with Uganda. He saw the people, not just their rulers. And so, when a young rebel named Yoweri Museveni launched a civil war in the early 1980s to take power from Milton Obote, it was Gaddafi who stepped up again. At a time when Museveni was isolated, underarmed, and politically toxic, he turned to the global powers for help. Washington and London refused. Their intelligence networks feared Museveni's connections to Gaddafi, a man they already viewed as a rogue, and so, like Amin before him, Museveni sought help from the one man who never said no. Gaddafi not only provided weapons, logistics, and advisors, but he also lent his full political support to Museveni's National Resistance Army, the NRA. That support changed the course of Ugandan history. In 1986, Museveni emerged victorious. He assumed the presidency, and Gaddafi's fingerprints were all over the victory. But unlike the transactional politics of the West, Gaddafi's loyalty didn't stop with Museveni's rise to power. He continued giving with no conditions. Libyan military officers trained Uganda's elite forces. Museveni even named Uganda's internal security organization after Libya's own intelligence model, mimicking its structure and doctrine. Gaddafi made frequent personal visits to Kampala, treated not as a foreign dignitary but as a familiar uncle, a benefactor, perhaps even a godfather of Uganda's statecraft. To the outside world, Uganda became Gaddafi's African safe house, the one country where he could land unannounced, be treated like royalty, and speak freely about his dream of a united continent. One of his most powerful gestures was the construction of the Gaddafi National Mosque in Kampala, an architectural and cultural monument that towered over the city skyline. With a capacity of over 3,000 worshippers, it was not just a mosque, it was a statement, a physical proof of Gaddafi's commitment to Uganda's Muslim community and to African Islamic heritage more broadly. His support wasn't religious, it was political, a rebuttal to Western Islamophobia, and a reaffirmation of Muslim presence in sub-Saharan Africa. But Gaddafi's investments didn't stop at religion. He took a personal interest in Uganda's cultural royalty, particularly the Toro Kingdom. In 2001, when the young king Oyo Nimba Kabamba Iguru Rukidi IV was still a child, Gaddafi financed the reconstruction of the royal palace. He poured resources into the kingdom's education and infrastructure. He treated Uganda's traditional rulers with respect that Uganda's own elites sometimes failed to show. Gaddafi even intervened in Museveni's family, personally promoting one of his sons in the military from captain to major, a move that, at the time, raised eyebrows but reflected just how entrenched and intimate his relationship with Museveni was. Gaddafi also shaped regional history through Uganda. It was via Museveni's government that he channeled weapons and funding to the Rwandan Patriotic Front in the 1980s, the same rebel movement that would overthrow Rwanda's Hutu-led regime and bring Paul Kagame to power. That was no coincidence. Gaddafi viewed regional struggles as a single African war, with Uganda as his gateway to influence Central Africa. It is therefore unimaginable, on paper, that Museveni or Kagame would ever turn against Gaddafi. But politics in Africa, as elsewhere, isn't about gratitude. It's about survival. And when Gaddafi's ideas became too bold, too disruptive for the global order, Museveni found himself caught between the man who made him and the powers who could unmake him. And so, he chose the latter. Ironically, in recent years, Museveni has spoken out about Gaddafi's death. He told the BBC in London that Africa should have intervened militarily to stop NATO from attacking Libya. "We should have taught them a lesson," he said. Libya was an African country being attacked by foreign powers. He even penned a letter in 2016, blaming the West for Gaddafi's fall, claiming the US and EU had no right to dislodge him. But these words, however loud, ring hollow. Because when Gaddafi needed his allies most, when bombs rained on Tripoli, Museveni stayed silent. He didn't send troops. He didn't call a summit. He didn't even stop Uganda from renaming the Gaddafi Mosque, erasing the name of the very man who built it. His betrayal wasn't in what he did. It was in what he allowed to happen. Because when a friend is being lynched and you say nothing, you are not neutral. You are complicit. But before we turn to how Gaddafi was betrayed, we have to understand how he was a threat and how the West considered using his allies as puppets. You see, Muammar Gaddafi's most dangerous weapon wasn't a missile, a jet, or even his oil wealth. It was an idea so bold, so revolutionary, that it sent shivers through Western capitals and panic through the palaces of Africa's long-serving presidents. That idea was the United States of Africa. Gaddafi envisioned a continent that was no longer bound by Berlin Conference borders, no longer dependent on the IMF, no longer kneeling for aid or begging for trade concessions. His dream was for a single African government, a unified army, a shared currency, one passport, and a common foreign policy. A geopolitical fortress capable of standing up to the US and the EU. But to build this union, Gaddafi needed unity among Africa's leaders. And that's where the dream began to die. Despite funding the creation and operations of the African Union, at times personally covering up to 15% of its budget, Gaddafi quickly discovered that most African presidents weren't interested in unity, especially not if it meant giving up their thrones. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. Yoweri Museveni was one of the loudest objectors. Publicly, Museveni dismissed Gaddafi's vision as impractical, citing linguistic and cultural differences, as if Africa hadn't overcome those in every liberation war it ever fought. But behind the curtain, the real issue was raw, personal power. Museveni had ruled Uganda since 1986. He had survived civil war, eliminated rivals, changed constitutions, and carefully crafted a dynastic political machine. The idea that he would reduce himself to a governor in Gaddafi's African Federation was unthinkable. Because Museveni wasn't building Africa, he was building his own empire within it. Gaddafi, on the other hand, wasn't just proposing reform. He was calling for revolution, one that would dismantle the fiefdoms of Museveni, Kagame, Debi, and others who had cemented themselves in power. So when the 2007 African Union Summit in Accra finally tabled Gaddafi's United States of Africa proposal, the reaction wasn't a surprise. It was sabotage. Gaddafi was expecting resistance from Western-backed leaders like Morocco or Botswana. But what stung most was that Museveni, the man he once armed and financed, led the opposition. Museveni didn't just reject the idea, he worked actively to kill it. Behind the scenes, Museveni reportedly engaged in secret discussions with American and British diplomats, warning them of Gaddafi's influence over smaller African nations and urging the West to contain Gaddafi's momentum before it was too late. Because Museveni understood something critical. If Gaddafi united Africa, he would lose control over Uganda. That realization turned an old friend into a quiet enemy. By 2008, the cracks in the Brotherhood had grown into a full fracture. What had started as ideological disagreement had now morphed into mutual suspicion and covert maneuvers. When Gaddafi made an unannounced visit to Uganda in 2008, he didn't arrive to meet ministers or campaign for investment. He came to speak directly to youth and traditional leaders, the roots of African culture. In a 37-minute speech at an Arab youth event, Gaddafi dropped a political bombshell. He called for Africa's traditional kings and chiefs, not elected politicians, to drive the continent's unity. It was a veiled insult directed at the likes of Museveni, autocrats who hid behind elections but clung to power like monarchs. Museveni got the message loud and clear, and he retaliated swiftly. Uganda's government blocked local traditional rulers from attending any further meetings with Gaddafi. Intelligence services were dispatched to monitor his visit, and whispers began to rise. Was Gaddafi trying to orchestrate a power base in Uganda? Paranoia spread. But instead of confronting Gaddafi publicly, Museveni took a quieter path, a more dangerous one. According to diplomatic cables and intelligence briefings, Museveni began providing information to Western intelligence agencies, particularly the US and UK, about Gaddafi's movements, his allies, and his Pan-African network. He warned them that Gaddafi might arm insurgents or retaliate politically. At one point, he even expressed fears that Gaddafi might attempt to sabotage his presidential aircraft, a claim that gave Western forces a pretext for heightened surveillance. And then, the betrayal was sealed. In June 2008, during his son's graduation in the United States, Museveni met with U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Jendai Fraser. He downplayed the idea of African unity, ridiculed Gaddafi's efforts to rally smaller states, and made one thing clear: he was not with Gaddafi anymore. 3 years later, in 2011, when NATO unleashed its full military force on Libya, raining fire over Tripoli, destroying Gaddafi's convoys, and pushing the country into chaos, Museveni remained silent. He didn't call for an AU emergency meeting. He didn't organize a protest. He didn't send observers or negotiators. He just watched. Even as Gaddafi was dragged through the streets of Sirte, humiliated, tortured, and executed by rebels backed by NATO air power, Museveni said nothing. And as if silence wasn't enough, Uganda's government later stripped the Gaddafi mosque of his name, the very mosque he built for the Ugandan people. The name was erased in a cowardly attempt to appease the new Western-backed Libyan regime. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a historical amputation, the deliberate removal of a benefactor's name, face, and legacy from the national memory. A man who had armed Uganda's rebels. A man who had built their infrastructure. A man who had invested in their kings and communities was deleted with the stroke of a pen, and no protest. However, Museveni was not the only one who betrayed Gaddafi. In 2011, Rwandan President Paul Kagame publicly supported the UN-authorized bombing of Libya and the no-fly zone imposed by the Security Council, claiming the situation had gone beyond the African Union's capacity. But the irony is striking. Kagame's rise to power was made possible in part by Gaddafi, who funded and armed the Rwandan Patriotic Front through Uganda. Gaddafi supported Kagame when no one else would. Yet, when Gaddafi was under attack, Kagame sided with the very powers that killed him, a move many see as the ultimate betrayal. After Muammar Gaddafi's brutal death in 2011, a moment that should have sent shockwaves of guilt and grief through every African capital, a strange silence blanketed the continent. Some leaders stayed quiet, others issued lukewarm condemnations, but a few, like Yoweri Museveni, began a different campaign, the campaign to rewrite history. In 2016, Museveni published a letter criticizing the West, calling out the United States and European Union for their role in destroying Libya. He condemned regime change. He warned that toppling stable governments would lead to endless conflict. He even suggested that Africa should have intervened militarily to protect Libya. But the irony was unbearable. Here was the man who had, for years, stood in Gaddafi's shadow, benefited from his weapons, his wealth, and his political cover, now pretending to be the wise elder, warning against the very chaos he helped make possible. Museveni's words came not from remorse, but from calculation. There was no apology. They were a smokescreen. Because by the time NATO had launched its operation, the groundwork had already been laid, not just by fighter jets, but by a web of betrayal spun by Gaddafi's supposed African allies. And Museveni, despite all the money, the military training, the political support, and even the personal promotions Gaddafi offered him, was one of the most important enablers of that betrayal. He refused to back Gaddafi's United States of Africa, fearing that it would reduce his grip on Uganda. He refused to rally support among African leaders when the West began circling Libya. He refused to send military support, diplomatic envoys, or even a symbolic gesture of resistance when NATO's missiles began to fall. He refused to speak up, even as Gaddafi's body was paraded through the streets like a trophy. Today, the cost of this betrayal is not measured only in Gaddafi's death. It is measured in what Africa lost when he died. We lost a man who dreamed of an African Union that wasn't just a diplomatic club, but a real sovereign power. We lost a leader who dared to propose an African currency backed by gold, to liberate the continent from IMF dependency. We lost a challenger to the global order, a man who made Africa his priority, not just his platform. And we lost him not simply because France wanted oil, or the US wanted regime change, or NATO wanted to flex. We lost him because those he thought were his brothers stood by and did nothing. Museveni himself has now ruled Uganda for nearly 40 years. He has changed constitutions, arrested opponents, rigged elections, and appointed his son as head of the military, but dares to lecture the world about sovereignty and democracy. Now, whenever you think of how NATO invaded Libya and killed Gaddafi, remember who allowed all that to happen in the first place. Who is to be blamed for Gaddafi's death? The West or African leaders who betrayed him? How can African leaders today speak of unity when they once sold out the very man who funded the African Union itself? In the comment section below, share your thoughts on why those he supported suddenly claimed he was going too far when Gaddafi proposed a single African currency and military force. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on Black Africa, its history, rich arts and culture, and things the world should know about. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.